Death of a poet, Magzhan Zhumabayev. I was exhausted, and my strength was exhausted. The day is chilly and the wind is grey. There is wailing and sobbing. I catch unclear speech. Somewhere far away, someone died and is being buried in the ground. Magzhan Zhumabayev. The men who were supposed to be killed, as a rule, were brought secretly at night, in cars with tags, bread or meat. They entered a hut and waited. The firing squad began to work at dawn. They were taken out in small groups. The list of those who were supposed to be shot was checked and then they were shot. Butovo was an exemplary place for execution. Yezhov supervised the right execution to show others how to do it. Other officers from other prisons came here to learn. That is how most of the repressed in the 1930s died. That's how Magzhan Zhumabayev died, according to the official version. But where does he lie buried? Where did he find his last refuge? And was he really shot? The mystery of the death of the poet. Representatives of 59 nationalities, including Kazakhs, were shot at the Butovo. We still do not know the burial place of Magzhan Zhumabayev. Not far from Almaty, there's a common grave. Chapter 1. The Son of the Sun. The night is dark, the world is exhausted. The night is black, the children suffer. But that ray in the east gets wider and wider. I'm going, I hurry to you, the son of the sun, prophet. Magzhan Zhumabayev. Secrets, omissions, and a series of prophetic symbols. Magzhan Zhumabayev was one of the most mysterious poets. He was influenced by Russian poets and European art in general. And European art at that time has experienced a surge in new trends. Decadence, symbolism, the poetics of doom. Or is it just a premonition of a future catastrophe? The passion for symbolism, how did it begin for Magzhan? Maybe he from a meeting with Konstantin Balmont. In 1915, the poet arrived in Omsk to give lectures. And at this time, Sakhan Sefulin and Magzhan Zhumabayev studied at the teacher's seminary. The young student, emotional, perceptive, he really plunges into this Omsk student life. Bauman's lectures titled Poetry as Magic were a great success. At the time, he was a well-known symbolist poet who has already served time in Butisk prison, a popular figure among students. Magzhan could not miss his lectures, and to hear, for example, the following poem. Death, lean over me. In the sky, the premonition of the day. Dusk pales the night. Death, lull me. Konstantin Balmont. Magzhan also has similar lines, grief for the dead wife and son. But it will be later. For now, his well-paced life has ended. The February Revolution, which like many intellectuals Magzhan received with delight. Then October Revolution. Now he is a member of Alash Order. And he's in the midst of his own personal drama. His wife dies, and then his child. And his very fate and his life always took place in very difficult circumstances. 1923, how it happened that the People's Commissar of Education, Lunacharsky, sent an invitation to Zhumabayev. It is still unclear. Alash Order member, and suddenly he's invited to give lectures to a starting proletarian writers. But it happened. Magzhan, at the personal invitation of the People's Commissar, traveled to Moscow. Magzhan was invited to the Communist University of Eastern Workers to teach Oriental literature. But Magzhan himself studies at the same time in the institute headed by Balmont's longtime friend, the theorist of symbolism, Brusov. He liked the idea of cultivating, as they said, the proletarian writers. By the way, Zhumabayev is also compared with Brusov. However, he called him the Kazakh Pushkin. Magzhan captivated Brusov with his high poetic talent. It is by nature, plus a deep knowledge of mathematics, music and fine art. He said so. From Zulika Zhumabayev's letter. Their communication was short. Brusov died in October 1924. A month later, at the university where Magzhan taught, they convened a meeting to discuss Zhumabayev's poems, at which the quote, "attention must be paid to the ideology depravity in his work." But in 1924, they did not shoot for such accusations. He did not even lose his job. A month later, in Orenburg, he held a literary trial on Zhumabayev, who was called a nationalist and a reactionary. And by the way, prominent people of that time participated in it. Sabit Mukhanov, Saken Sifulin and others. His published poems were withdrawn and were not allowed to be published again. All this seemed to be a planned action ordered from above. What was the reason for it? Careless words, envious colleagues, or the wrong connections? Chapter 2. Moscow Pages. The era of the revolutionary spirit. The old is destroyed. The new has not yet been created, and there is a great temptation to create a brand new future. And they worked on it, only this did not last long. Magzhan is in Moscow, in the publishing house Vostok, translates different works by Heine, Goethe, Byron, Gorky and Lenin, and communicates a lot. They say that he became especially close with Osip Mandelstam and his fellow classmate Mikhail Svetlov. Osip Emilovich said that this steppe poet always has Pegasus saddled. When Magzhan appeared among Moscow writers, Mandelstam explained, "This is a non-human, but a centaur. The argamack of poetry is prancing under it." Mandelstam called him the magician, and I called him Jean, from the memories of Mikhail Svetlov. He had something of Yesenin in him. That's what people said about Zhumabayev. In his appearance and in poetry, the same hurricane of feelings and sensuality. They probably met, probably communicated, but they hardly liked each other. The poet Yesenin was a complex character. The atmosphere that prevailed in the poetic environment of the time, in the creative environment, and in general among the intelligentsia, was very controversial. Meeting places of Moscow writers, now not preserved, Cafe Stall of Pegasus, and the club of the All-Russian Union of Poets, aka Domino. On the second floor, a hospital for the mentally ill, and, gathering at a cafe, they said, "Let's go to a madhouse." They came here to drink a dubious coffee and something stronger. They argued about the fate of literature and the calling of the poet. Cowrie leaf tea, eclairs on saccharin, horse meatballs, an unimaginable delicacy, and all this accompanied by the poems of Brusov, Mayakovsky, Yesenin, Mandelstam. Jean sometimes helped us financially. The Kazakh poet always took over the expenses at the cafe. He had another habit when he saw Osip Emilovich. He always began to read his poems. Mandelstam was happy, like a boy, and shouted, "How magically you read my poems," from the memories of Mikhail Svetlov. Around the same time, Zhumabayev decides to create a literary organization, Alka, a necklace, the prototype of the Union of Writers of Kazakhstan. He developed a charter and sent it to his colleagues. He was not supported. In 1927, Magzhan returned to Kazakhstan, and in 1929 the poet was arrested in Petropavlovsk. The prosecution was largely connected with his Moscow activities. He was accused of creating a counter-revolutionary organization. His term was 10 years, Lubyanka. Uterka Karelia Solovki. He was twice repressed. Once Maxim Gorky helped him, because he was the greatest poet. He was released ahead of time in 1936. According to his friends, he came back a completely different person. And a year later, he was arrested again. According to the official version, he was shot in Almaty on March the 19th, 1938. But is it true? Chapter 3, In the Arms of Eternity. Blind, do not be sad in the darkness. The time is near. And I go, I go, I go. Do you see me? From the Huns, the originating prophet, Magzhan Zhumabayev. Relatives, as a rule, were not immediately informed of death, and for a long time many of them brought different things to him in prison, and the guards took them, but there was no one to pass it on to. Sometimes it was the opposite. They said that the person was no longer alive, and he was still serving a sentence in the camp, or simply issued a certificate of death, but did not indicate the place or burial, and people did know that this man was shot and not lost in the Magzhan region. This story became known in the late 1990s. Allegedly, Magzhan was not shot. He died later in a camp near Magzhan. If he served there, there should be some paperwork in the National Security Committee. We work closely with the archivist and the organization that stores the documents of those who were served in the Magzhan prison and camp, and they discovered that there were 5 people with the last name Zhumabayev, but there was no Magzhan among them. There is another version. Magzhan died in Petropavlovsk, in prison. He was just beaten to death. They were beating hard, so to speak, to the exhaustion of the one who beat him and the exhaustion of the one who was being beaten. The documents on the repressed graves were classified. Some are still classified as secret files, and many are simply missing. After the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev made a political decision not to disclose the truth to relatives about where and how and when their relatives died during the years of mass repression. In the case of Magzhan, if his friends from the capital were mentioned in the case, he could be sent back to Moscow, the researchers said, and maybe he was shot there. The prison guard came close and shot the prisoner in the back of the head, and the body of a man was already falling into the huge mass grave. How many people died at the Butova camp? Nobody will ever know. Only 20,000 names are known. Magzhan Zhumabayev is not on this list. The gloomy prison building of the NKVD Almaty. Perhaps the last days of the poet were spent here. Sometimes they shot people in the basement. Kandlisai, a bloody ravine that is located in Burundi. They say the bodies of the shot were brought here. To this day, it's very difficult to actually find the place of Magzhan's burial. They could have shot him in the village of Zhanalik, which is also near Almaty. Here, in 2013, human remains were found during construction, and this was not the first time. It is possible that there were other burial places. Epilogue. My poems will live without me. He loved life so much, but it was merciless towards him. 45 years old, almost 10 of them he spent in prison and exile. Is the fate of the poet, the fate of the prophet, simple? And is his death a mystery? It's time for me to go with everyone. I drink the sweetest flower of my heart. You come and lull me death to sleep. Magzhan Zhumabayev. My poems will live without me, the lines of a prophet. Of course he can be compared to Yesenin, Khrushchev, Beaumont and Pushkin. But all this will not be true. He was and will be Magzhan Zhumabayev.